I'll start it now and people can join
Sounds good.
in. Um, all right. All right. Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining in on the Marine Institute Graduate Society Seminar Series. We meet every week on Wednesdays at noon. However, this is the last one. So, I mean, you can come next week, but we won't be here. This is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel where you can find almost all of our seminars over the past couple years. Before we do start, I want to provide a land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge the territory in which we gather as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, and the island of Newfoundland as the ancestral homeland of the Mi'kmaq and Beothuk. We would also like to recognize the Inuit of Nunatsiavut and Nunatuckavut, and the Innu of Nitassinan and their ancestors as the original peoples of Labrador. We strive for respectful relationships with all the peoples of this province as we search for collective healing and true reconciliation and honor this beautiful land together. Now, join me in welcoming today's seminar speaker. Dr. Vincent Lecours is with us from the University of Florida, where he's an assistant professor. Dr. Lecours specializes in marine remote sensing and geospatial analysis, lots of GIS, lots of spatial modeling. He helps unite the disciplines of geomatics and fisheries sciences. We always love getting somebody who's an expert in one field, kind of like dip into fisheries. You know, it's like having a statistician come in and help us with our stats because we all need the help. So Dr. Lecours actually graduated with his PhD from MUN in 2016, where he was in the Marine Geomatics Research Lab, which don't bother looking for it, doesn't exist anymore. He teaches or has taught several courses at UF, including spatial sciences for marine environmental characterization and marine geomatics. That's kind of like his specialties. Dr. Lecours has quite a few PhD and master's students, so I have a feeling it works really hard. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Lecours.
Well, thank you, Colin. Let me share my screen. All right, that should be working now. So you're seeing the right one, cover screen, right?
Yeah, it looks good to
Okay.
me.
Okay, great, thanks. Well, hi everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here today and talking to you about some of the work I've done. As Colin mentioned, I did my PhD at Mons. I have fond memories of St. John's and living on the island. So today I'm going to be presenting a little bit about an overview of some of the projects we've done in the lab. We have a pretty big team right now of PhDs and master's students, so we have a lot of ongoing projects, but I'm going to be really focusing on two of the most advanced one, but keep in mind that most of what I'm going to present today is kind of a work in progress. So, what I do is really try to provide an interdisciplinary perspective on data collection and analysis for the study of the environment. So initially, I was trained in applied geomatics. So I was trained in remote sensing, GIS, cartography, and spatial analysis. But my field of application was always the environment or the study of the environment. And right about when I moved to St. John's to do my grad studies at MUN, I started looking into the marine environment because I quickly realized that the marine environment lagged behind in terms of the methods and technologies to efficiently study it, the knowledge of the environment itself, and of its ecological patterns and processes. So here at the University of Florida, I head the Marine Geomatics Lab, and our main field of application is habitat mapping. And that term in itself really explains my affiliations. So for example, I'm affiliated with our Fisheries and Aquatic Sciences program, which relates really to the habitat component of a habitat mapping. And I'm also affiliated with the Geomatics program for all the mapping component. So what I'd like to start with is to actually provide a working definition of habitats, because many different people will have different definitions of habitats, but the one I used for marine habitat, it's basically areas that are significantly different from their surroundings in terms of their physical, chemical, or biological and chemical characteristics when observed at particular spatial and temporal scales. So you'll see throughout my presentation that the concept of scale is really underpinning in most of the work that I do. So habitat mapping is really an interdisciplinary endeavor where we need acousticians and hydrographers, geologists and geomorphologists, biologists, ecologists, oceanographers, and then every now and then we're going to look towards the geographers, which is where I kind of fit in. The spatial scientists slash geographers really try to combine all the information provided by other experts and situate them in a common frame of reference, which is geographic. So if I oversimplify the process of habitat mapping, first we go out in the field, we collect different types of data. Then all those data are processed and integrated together in that kind of common geographic frame of reference and are integrated into habitat models. And the habitat models can be a lot of different things. They can be unsupervised or supervised classification that come more from the remote sensing literature, or they can also be algorithms to do species distribution modeling, which comes more from the ecological or biogeographical literature. And then we get our maps. And too often, that's where our exercise stops. So we provide our maps and then we assume that our work is done. But it's very important to consider what comes next, because a lot of those habitat maps are used in decision making for conservation, management, restoration of resources. So we got to put some thought into how our maps are built and how well do they convey the information, the relevant information for the decision makers. So while by now I've really worked in all those different steps of the habitat mapping process, my focus really remained in how do we integrate spatial data that represent different environmental characteristics together in in habitat models. So I actually started, as I mentioned earlier, for my grad studies at MUN doing predictions of cold water coral and sponges distributions. So I had access to some great data that were collected by my advisors, Rodolphe and Evan, on deep sea coral habitats of the island of Newfoundland. So we see here the Orphan Knoll, the Flemish Cap, and the Gully. And they collected the data using ROPUS, which is a pretty big remotely operated vehicle that was equipped with a lot of different instruments. And the main instrument for my part of the work was a multi-beam echo sounder. So if you're not familiar with this type of instrument, the multi-beam echo sounder basically sends different beams of sound towards the seafloor. And by looking at the time it takes for the beams of sound to go from the sensor to the seafloor and back to the sensor, we're able to get these 3D models of the seafloor. But on top of that, the ROV, the ROPUS ROV, was also equipped with very high resolution camera, which really allowed us to observe the environment in situ. So we're able to see which types of species are found in the environment, what's the geomorphology of the environment, what's the superficial geology, and so on. So from this very rich data set, there's a lot of different things we can do. And one of the things that we worked on is to provide some abiotic classifications where we take all the environmental characteristics and try to identify these potential habitats. So the areas of the seafloor that are significantly different from each other just in terms of their environmental characteristics. And once we have these statistically different habitats, we can then start making spatial associations. For example, here habitat F3 was represented by higher rugosity and lower oxygen concentration than the other habitats. So then we're able to see that, for example, that's the habitat type that hosted or sheltered the highest level of biodiversity. So there's a lot of different species that was most associated with that particular habitat. And then it also allows us to find specific habitats, for example, this one that was characterized by topographic highs in the deepest, coldest waters that are associated with one specific species of coral. So it really helped us start providing an understanding of what could be driving different species distribution in the deep sea. Then we can move forward and do what we call biotic classifications, which is, in this case, species distribution modeling, where we can use different algorithms to link the presence or absence of a species with specific environmental conditions to try to determine, to predict where the species is most likely to be found. And then from that, we can identify what may be either a direct or an indirect surrogate of the different species. So for example, here, we see that for that first species, its distribution was mostly driven by oxygen concentration and temperature. While for the second one, what was mostly driving the distribution is two variables that represent the orientation of the slope, which we know is often correlated with currents. And we know from the biology of this species that they need a certain level of current to bring them food and rid the sediments of them. So we can really start making links between the spatial information that we have and the biology of the species. So that's some of the work that I did at MUN during my grad studies. And one of the first things I did when I moved to Florida was to try to see how could I apply what I've done up there down here. And luckily, a few years ago, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which is a federal entity in the US, released this data set. So that's the bathymetry, so the depth values in the deep Gulf of Mexico. So we have part of Florida here on the east and Texas on the west. And this data set is really big. It has billions of pixels that have 12-meter spatial resolution. And because of the sheer size of the data set, it hasn't been used a lot for any type of modeling. It was used mostly for qualitative characterization, so people looking at it, identifying features on the seafloor and so on. But at UF, we have one of the biggest supercomputer in the US. So I was able to use that data set and really try to experiment and do different type of modeling with it. So the first thing that I usually do with these type of data set is derive different terrain characteristics from it. So for example, it's relatively simple in GIS to derive slope values, so local slope values from the bathymetric values. We have here our two variables that represents the orientation of the slope, which informs on currents. And I give an example of a curvature, which identify areas that are convex or concave, which has relevance for sedimentation patterns and geomorphology. And then once we have these kind of variables, and you know, usually I produce a set of about 18 of these different terrain characteristics, we can link them spatially with the presence of different corals and sponges. So NOAA, which is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, sponsors a lot of ROV dives in the Gulf of Mexico, where we get the identification of different species from video data that we're then able to geolocate. And then combining, we can use different approaches to combine the presence of these different species with the environmental variables to get species distribution models. So what you're seeing here is the black pixels are actually the areas that are suitable or suitable habitats for different groups of corals and sponges, and where there's no color, it's unsuitable. And looking at these models allows us to identify those species that prefers the continental shelf, those that prefer the continental slope, and those that prefer the abyssal plains. But it also helps us identify, for example, the species that are considered specialist, which means that they tolerate only a very narrow range of environmental variables, or those species that are more generalist, that can tolerate a wide range of environmental variables, meaning that their suitable habitats is more widespread. And then once we have multiple models for multiple species, we can really try to begin to do different type of spatial analysis. So for example, we can start looking at biodiversity. What are the habitats that host many species? What are those habitats that are suitable only for one specific species? And then we can also start doing overlapping with different, you know, situate these models into context, for example, for oil and gas exploration. So the Gulf of Mexico has a lot of oil and gas exploitation, and unfortunately, there are only very tiny areas that are protected in the Gulf of Mexico. So that's until recently, because they extended that marine protected area, but until recently, only 3 small areas in the Gulf were protected. And we can see that in the literature, there's been an argument that the influence of oil and gas infrastructure is directly impacting local habitats, seafloor habitats up to 4 kilometers. So what you see here is a 4-kilometer buffer around oil and gas infrastructure, and we can see that the 3 protected areas are actually potentially impacted by active infrastructure right now. So using that information, we can even go further and create different scenarios for the implementation of a network of marine protected areas in the Gulf. So what we did here, based on the literature, we identified the areas that are greater than 100 square kilometers outside of the 4-kilometer buffer that is considered the zone of influence of oil and gas infrastructure. And we can identify entire areas that we could propose for marine protected areas that would protect deep sea corals and sponges, but at the same time limit the economic impact on active and existing infrastructure. Excuse me. So once we have these kind of proposed marine protected areas, we can really dive into different conservation scenarios. So depending on what the conservation goals are, if the goal is to protect the biggest area possible, well, then we could look into implementing this marine protected area here, so G, which is the biggest that we have. However, even if it's the biggest one, it would only protect one specific species. So in this case, maybe we should look into implementing marine protected area C, because that's the smallest marine protected area, but the entirety almost of the proposed area is suitable for corals and sponges, and it's also the one that has the most, that is suitable for the most species. So we can really start implementing different trade-offs and scenarios into looking at those proposed areas. So if we ever were, which I'm surprised would ever happen, but if we ever were to implement all that network of marine protected area, we could protect 6,000 square kilometers in the Gulf of critical coral habitats. So all those models are to take with a grain of salt at this point in time, because we've been really trying to optimize the models and make them as robust as possible so that decision making can actually trust the models. So what we've been doing right now is using what we call Ensemble modeling, which uses different modeling approaches and repeat them and do a lot of cross-validations, really to ensure that we get the best of all the existing modeling approaches and that we can really trust our models. And one of the advantages of using Ensemble modeling is that we also get a value of uncertainty associated with our models. So then, once again, this is really critical information to support decision making. We're also doing some evaluation of trade-offs between sample size and spatial scale, because a lot of the observations of corals from ROV data is actually not all as accurate in space. So the NOAA dataset, for example, has 3 levels of spatial accuracy. Sometimes when you have a coral observation, you can say that it's accurate within 20 meters. Sometimes it's accurate within 50 meters, and sometimes it's accurate within 100 meters. So we have a relatively high spatial resolution for our environmental data, but the spatial resolution of the environmental data has to match that spatial accuracy or inaccuracy of our species occurrences. So the higher the spatial resolution of the models, the lower your sample size, because you have to disregard some inaccurate presences. And we're dealing here in deep sea habitats where our sample size is already not very big. So those trade-offs are important to consider. Then we're also evaluating different trade-offs between sample size and thematic scale. Once again, from our ROV data, we're not always able to identify coral individual to the species level. So if we make models, for example, at the family level, we can really increase our sample size, but may lose those fine scale species habitat preferences that may differ across species. And then we're also looking into endemism mapping and diversity mapping. So ultimately, what we're really hoping with that project is that we're going to get a set of really robust maps that can support conservation and management of resources in the deep Gulf of Mexico. So that's just a quick overview of the work that I've done that really follows from what I've done at MUN for my grad studies. But one of the things I realized quickly when I moved to Florida is that we actually don't have a lot of deep waters. The continental shelf of Florida is very long and very shallow. So I quickly had to kind of adapt my approaches and go back to my earlier background, which was terrestrial remote sensing. Because when we do coastal habitat mapping and monitoring, we are not using, for example, multi-beam echo sounders. We're going to be using satellite imagery and drone data. So I started getting interested in coastal habitats more than the deep sea habitats. Coastal habitats in Florida really provide a wide range of critical ecosystem services. So they protect from erosion and storm. They provide a lot of opportunities for tourism and outdoor activities. They provide habitats for other species and enhance our local fisheries and recreational fisheries. However, as you may know, many of these habitats and the services they provide are currently facing extreme pressure in the state. So we have a lot of unsustainable tourism, inadequate protection and management. We're at the forefront of climate change and pollution. One of the main issues right now that our state agency, wildlife agency, is facing is that the ongoing restoration and monitoring efforts often don't have baseline data against which to quantify success. So it's very challenging to make good decisions when you don't have the baseline data to base your decision of. So there's really a need for frequent, effective, and comprehensive mapping and monitoring methods. So one of the main habitat types that I've been focusing on are the oyster reefs. Oysters are one of the most important biological resources that is currently monitored in the Gulf. They have a high cultural and economic relevance in the state of Florida and other Gulf states. And unfortunately, we estimate the decline in reef area to reach more than 66% since 1982, and the trend keeps going downward. So what we've implemented a few years back is a multi-scale framework for coastal habitat mapping and monitoring that is based on remote sensing. So the idea was that we would use satellite imagery and satellite radar data to first identify the hotspot of oyster resources in the state of Florida. Then we would do some field work using drones and go map different estuaries, for example, that present a high level of oyster reefs. And then we also did some fine scale modeling, trying to understand how the fine scale 3D structure of the oyster reefs contributes to, for example, habitat provision or water filtration and these kind of things. But today I'm really going to be focusing on that kind of intermediate scales. So using drone data, which kind of information on oyster reefs can we extract? But what we quickly realized is that we're dealing with a very dynamic environment. So actually, even if our main interest was in oyster reefs, we really have to adopt an ecosystemic perspective. Because when our oyster reefs are not doing well, they'll erode and transform into mud flats, which will then be colonized by the salt marshes. So there's really a complex dynamic and interplay between which habitat is dominant in a certain place. And these changes can occur very fast. So it's not enough to say, well, we're interested in oyster reefs, we're going to map oyster reefs. We actually have to map the entire ecosystem to better understand these different interplays. So that little blue star is Gainesville. That's where I'm based. That's where the University of Florida is. And one of our main study sites is on the West Coast, so about an hour and 20 minutes from Gainesville. Most of the data I'll show today come from a little place called Little Trout Creek. So when we first started exploring this area, we first went to collect some drone data to quantify intertidal habitat relative coverage. So this is the type of photo mosaics that we can create from our drone data, and we can clearly see some mudflats, some salt marshes, and some oyster reefs. And this data is at very, very high resolution, spatial resolution. So here, every single pixel in the image is 6 millimeters. So we get a lot of details. And in theory, the idea behind it is that in theory, we could be able to see individual oysters on the reefs. Then we can see our mudflats here and an oyster reef. And the oyster reef, we can even see the scars left by boat propellers when the tide is higher. So using these data, the main approach that we use is what we call an object-based image analysis. So in remote sensing and in image analysis, usually we adopt a pixel-based approach, which means that we look at every single pixel in the imagery and then assign it to a statistically significant class. However, with the object-based approach, what we do is that we take every single pixel, look at the immediate neighbors of that pixel, and if they are relatively homogeneous, they get regrouped into an object. And then we keep going until we find a certain level of heterogeneity that indicates a change in object type. So for example, here we can clearly see that we have some good separation. We have objects capturing the reefs and the marshes much better than we would if we were adopting a pixel-based approach. So what's classified then? It's the objects and not the individual pixels. Excuse me. So this here is the kind of results that we get. So this is a habitat map. We can see the relative coverage of our different habitat types in the landscape. This was our first attempt about 5 years ago, and we reached an accuracy, a map accuracy of about 80%, which in the remote sensing literature is pretty high. However, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit, if our goal here is to do temporal monitoring, we need an accuracy that's much higher than that, because we need to be able to say whether from 1 year to the next a habitat type has actually changed or not. So we started looking into the causes of that accuracy, like what kind of hindered our accuracies. And what we quickly found is that the water and the tidal movement really causes differences in the images and artifacts in how it looked. So I'm bringing back here the mosaic, and you can clearly see some lines going throughout the mosaic. And this is only caused by the way that even if we're at the lowest tide, the tide is always moving. So every time the drone flies above the habitats, the water is at a slightly different level than at the previous line or the previous transect. And then there's also the issue that, for example, a wet oyster is going to look different than a dry oyster to the computer. And it's the same for mudflats and salt marshes. So if we have waves crashing on our reef, or just the tide just came low and it's not dry yet, the computer will have difficulties recognizing that a dry oyster is the same thing as a wet oyster. And then when we look at the spectral information carried by these data, we realize that for the computer, it's actually quite difficult to recognize these different type of habitats because they show a pretty similar response or signature. So for monitoring, we really needed to do better. So we wonder what could we do to increase that accuracy of about 80%. So we tried different spatial like GIS wizard tools to try to really help here. So for example, we applied different types of filters like a Laplacian filters to first detect the water objects and then remove the water objects from the mosaic to then reclassify our different habitat types without the or with the limited influence of water. But then there's a way to totally get rid of the spectral information, and it's to use structure from motion photogrammetry to produce a digital surface model. So a little bit like a multi-beam echo sounder does underwater, we're able to use drone data to produce a 3D model of our study area. And then once we have that 3D model, we can derive different terrain characteristics, exactly like what I showed earlier in the deep Gulf of Mexico. So we can derive slope, terrain complexity, different types of curvatures, and so on. And we really had high hopes that this would solve all our problems. And of course it didn't. And the main reason is quite simple, is that all these different terrain characteristics are derived using a window of analysis of 3 by 3 pixels. So if we're measuring slope over a scale, in this case of 1.8 centimeters, which is the spatial resolution, 6 millimeters times 3. So obviously, if we're trying to characterize habitats at the landscape level, looking at fine scale terrain characteristics over like 1.8 centimeters may not actually help recognizing the different habitat types. So we know from the ecological and the geographic literature that different habitats are characterized by different features and different patterns that will relate to ecological processes at different spatial scales. It's well known that single-scale studies may fail to capture the relevant patterns and processes. So the solution is to actually implement what we call multiscale analyses. And there's different ways that we can implement multiscale analyses. The first one, which is quite common in remote sensing, is what we call coarse graining, which involves a resampling or averaging of our data. So you can see here, for example, that we have our data set at 1 centimeter resolution, and we coarsen it all the way to 31 centimeter resolution. So we lose some of the fine scale details. And what's really interesting here is that statistically speaking, so you can see some changes in accuracies when using data at different spatial resolution, but statistically speaking, these differences are not significant, which means that you could collect your data at 21 centimeter and get relatively similar results. And that has a lot of implication, for example, if we're to make recommendations to our state wildlife agency, because to collect high resolution data, you have to take your drone really low at low altitude, which means that you don't get the same coverage on the same battery life. But if we're telling the state agency that for their monitoring efforts, they could actually get their drone higher, they would get a much higher coverage, which would make a huge difference in resources needed if they are to survey the entire state or an entire portion of coast. Another interesting result is that if we take away, so far we've been looking at accuracies of the entire classification, but if we look at the spatial resolution that best captured, for example, the marshes and the ones that best captured the mudflats, we realize that that resolution is different for different habitat types, which really hammer down once again that there is no single scale that is optimal for the study of all habitats. So that's quite an interesting result. And right now we're testing whether integrating data at 23 centimeters, 9, 17, and 5 centimeters can actually improve our segmentation that would lead eventually to a better classification, because we would kind of optimize the detection and delineation of each habitat type individually. So yeah, so right now we're wondering whether the implementation of a multi-scale approach would improve coastal habitat monitoring. Another way to implement multi-scale analyses is to change the analysis scale. So I mentioned earlier that when we derive things like slope and rugosity, we use a 3 by 3 window of analysis. But we don't have to use a 3 by 3 window of analysis. We can use a 5 by 5, 7 by 7, 9 by 9. And usually the GIS software will offer you a default 3 by 3, and this is why it's so common. But we have the ability to use different analysis windows. So I actually worked with some colleagues at MUN to implement that approach. And what you can see here is that we add 14 different environmental variables or terrain variables that we derive at 8 different analysis scales, which gave us a total of 112 variables. And we were able to make our models with 112 variables, but it's very computationally intensive and would not be feasible even with a supercomputer if we had, for example, to make models at the state of, over the entire Gulf of Mexico. So we wondered, could these multiple scales be integrated into one single dataset? And we didn't have to think very far because about at the same time, a colleague at the University of Guelph in Ontario uh, released a tool that did just that. So within Whitebox Tools, which is a suite of GS software, John offered a tool called Multiscale Roughness. And what Multiscale Roughness does is that for each pixel in your dataset, it calculates roughness or rugosity using a range of different window analysis, so 3 by 3, 5 by 5, 7 by 7, and so on. And then we'll extract the maximum value of rugosity recorded and the scale at which that maximum value of rugosity was calculated. So we get two outputs instead of 112. We get what's the maximum roughness that was calculated and what's the scale of that maximum roughness. So we wonder whether we could use multiscale terrain attributes to extract a topographic signature for each habitat type, independent of spectral responses. So the idea here is that our oysters are very complex at a fine scale. You know, they provide those 3D environments a little bit like corals would. So we were wondering if calculating the multiscale roughness could allow us to, or not us, but the computer to recognize or differentiate oysters from the other habitat types. So we applied the multiscale roughness tool to our dataset. We use analysis scales varying between 3 and 9,750, which is our finest scale feasible, but also the scale of our biggest feature in the landscape. And we got this kind of results. So here you can see the magnitude of the roughness that is calculated for our habitat types and the scale at which it was calculated. And knowing by observation where our different habitat types are, we're then able to extract statistics on the multiscale roughness of our different habitat types. And what we found is that our salt marshes had the highest values of roughness that was fine or calculated at the finest scales. And that makes a lot of sense. And it's kind of a miscalculation on our part because our hypothesis was that our oysters would have the highest roughness at the finest scales. But these 3D models actually capture the vegetation on top of the marsh, which produce that kind of fine scale, high level rugosity. So that's why we have salt marshes coming so strongly on the rugosity. Then, as expected, our mudflats at the lowest values of roughness and the highest values of roughness for mudflats were calculated at the broadest scales. And then we had our oysters, which had relatively high roughness at relatively fine scales, but not as much as the marshes. And what's interesting here is that because we know the spatial resolution of our data, and we can calculate, for example, the median scale of roughness for each habitat type, or the mean one, we can actually kind of start integrating and calculating the ecological scale at which the patterns representing each habitat types into the landscape can be measured. So for example, we can establish that the marshes are the patterns for marshes are best captured at around 1.5 meter extent, that are mudflats at around 13 meters, and our oysters at around 5 meters. So this preliminary study really showed us that we can differentiate coastal habitats using their multi-scale topographic characteristics, meaning that we could eventually develop topographic signatures to allow a computer to automatically recognize and delineate habitat types. So I just wanted to show you some examples. So we have that salt marsh that I've been showing over and over. Here we have the digital surface model derived from our data, so the elevation and depth underwater. And here we have our multi-scale rugosity. And what we have is really a patch of salt marsh surrounded by oysters. And we can really see that the multi-scale roughness tool, whether it's with the magnitude of rugosity or the scale at which that rugosity is calculated, really shows different patterns for the patch of salt marsh and the surrounding oysters. Then this example is quite interesting because we're looking at a mud flat, and looking at the imagery, it just looks like mud. It looks like nothing's on top of it. Then we derive our digital surface model, and same thing. It just looks like a relatively, what we would expect from a mudflat, relatively simple, no rugosity on it. But then deriving our multiscale rugosity measures, we're actually seeing a pattern emerge in the center of the mudflat. And we went back into the field because we've studied that estuary quite a bit, and it's actually right. There are individual oysters found on that particular mudflat. So all our automated analyses had totally missed these oysters until we used the multi-scale roughness that captured really those little oyster clusters on top of the mudflat. And then my last example here, we have an oyster reef showing different density of oysters on the surroundings versus the metal. And once again, we can see that the patterns of multiscale rugosity captures those differences in densities. So there's a lot of promising avenues to explore from these preliminary studies. So our next step is to extend the analysis to other multiscale terrain attributes. So we're looking, for example, here at the multiscale topographic position that would highlight the areas that are more elevated or lower than their surroundings. And we can see, for example, here that the scar, the boat propeller scar is well captured with that particular metric. So that's a potential new avenue to explore, see if we can detect scarring from these kind of analyses. Then I mentioned earlier that what we used was a digital surface model that captures the top of the vegetation on the salt marsh. But we can also go further into our photogrammetry remote sensing analysis and actually remove that vegetation from our salt marshes, which would provide what we call a DTM, a digital terrain model. So the hypothesis here is that by removing the vegetation, then our oyster reefs would come up as the highest rugosity type of habitat. And we also went over and collected LiDAR data to compare DSMs and DTMs produced from LiDAR data, which are much more expensive to produce compared to a structure from motion photogrammetry. Then the ultimate goal is to bring all of these into our object-based image analysis workflow and try to see if we can increase the accuracy of our classifications. And more ecologically speaking, we want to see if the topographic signature of intertidal oysters, so those that I showed more examples of, is similar to that of subtidal oysters. So this past fall, we went out there and used a little autonomous surface vehicle to map subtidal oyster reefs. And so we're going to get that multi-beam kind of 3D model to compare with our intertidal habitats. And we're currently testing underwater photogrammetry using cameras, but experiencing a lot of issues with currents, and our system is not strong enough. So I can't promise anything that anything good is going to happen with the underwater photogrammetry. And then finally, we acquired a new drone recently, which has more spectral bands. So from a remote sensing perspective, instead of just looking at the red, green, and blue part of the spectrum, which conveys an image similar to what our human eyes see, we have more spectral bands that will allow us to see things that our eyes couldn't see, and hopefully that might help our classifications. So as I mentioned, ultimately, all we want to do is optimize variable and scale selection for our object-based image analysis workflow for coastal mapping and monitoring. And the ultimate goal is to just have a simple R script, open source, that we can share with our state wildlife agency partners that they could implement in their monitoring efforts. So they are still at the stage where they sent a team of biologists in the field to take sparse GPS point, which doesn't really give them a broad scale picture and understanding of how those ecosystems are doing. And hopefully our drone-based workflow, open source, would solve a lot of issues and save them a lot of trouble. So in conclusion, I hope that these little examples kind of demonstrate how geomatics, so remote sensing, GIS cartography, and spatial analysis can assist with data collection for marine habitat mapping, habitat mapping and modeling, and to eventually produce products that can really, robust products that can really support decision making. And again, that was just two main projects out of many others that are going in the lab. But I hope that gave you a taste of what we do. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. That was great. So far out of my wheelhouse. I loved it though. Yeah, so if we have any questions for Dr. Lecours, go ahead and raise your hand. I'll call on you. You can type in the chat also. I know I see a few names in here who do the ocean mapping at the Marine Institute, so I expect questions. Yeah, it's nice when we have somebody come in that does something that I actually have experience doing. I can actually chime in here. All right, we have a couple. We have one from Patrick. I would pronounce that Gagnon.
Yes, correct.
All right, great.
Thank you. Great presentation, Dr. Lecours. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
So I'm Pat Gagnon. I'm based at the Ocean Sciences at MUN, and I'm using drone technology and satellite imagery to map subtidal features, so including kelp beds. So I wonder if you guys have thought of acquiring spectral signatures in situ of your different benthic classes and try to classify based on those signatures. I know it's kind of old school, but have you thought of doing that?
Yeah, we did. We haven't done it yet, but we did think about that, and this is part of the reason where we acquired recently that vertical takeoff fixed wing drone that I showed towards the end, which is with 10 spectral bands, because this one actually allows calibration. So we're able to get, before each of our flight, we have a target, radiometric target, where we can calibrate our instruments, and which then allows to compare the same habitat types throughout different dates, regardless of light conditions and these kind of things. When these experimentations started, we were using relatively cheap off-the-shelf drones that don't offer calibration or anything, and that's quickly something we realize is that the spectral signature of, for example, the Oyster reefs from one day to the next would be different just because of the lack of calibration. So we haven't used like the radiometer to or spectrophotometer, I think they are called, to capture the in situ spectral signature of each habitat types, but we started at least calibrating our instruments to ensure a constant signature return from these habitat types.
Right. So the new drone you're getting, you say, has 10 bands, right? So like, do you get into the infrared?
Yes.
Okay. So with that, you could maybe clear the vegetation, right? And
yeah, exactly.
work
And
with the rest. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, we got to look into vegetation and disease to clear it. It has a coastal band too that is aligned with what Landsat 8 offers, so a kind of yellow band. So we just this past week collected some data over the subtidal reefs to see if we can do drone-derived bathymetry, with that yellow band. So I think these data sets are really rich on potential, but we're just starting to explore them.
For sure. Great work. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, Keith Lewis, I saw you next.
Great, thanks, Colin, and thank you for the talk. I've got one very basic question and then maybe another one. The basic question is that I have probably a very elementary understanding of how all the remote sensing works, but some understanding of the spectral resolution, and that's great that you're getting up to 10 bands. How does you were measuring, I think, roughness. Can you provide some like very elementary explanation of how that works? What is it that you're actually measuring, and how is it that the remote sensing, what is it the remote sensing platform is picking up on?
Yeah, okay, yeah, that's a great question. So when we do all the roughness work, it has nothing to do with the spectral information that the sensor provides.
Sure.
The way it works is, with photogrammetry, we're able to reproduce the 3D model of that area, and then it's a relatively simple. So each pixel now represents an elevation, and the variation in elevation can be quite small. So we can have, for example, a pixel here that's going to show, well, that's a 2.1 centimeter elevation above sea level, and the next one might be at 1.9. And then by looking at, we're doing basically focal analysis. So we're looking around there. And for example, the simplest measure we can calculate to calculate rugosity is standard deviation. So if within that window of analysis, the standard deviation amongst pixels is high, it means that we have a lot of the variation, which represents rugosity in the field.
Okay, so if I understand right, like on the pure mud flat, the elevation is going to be fairly uniform over a broad scale, and because you have so many pixels, it'll show up as flat. Whereas if you had oysters or a very patchy vegetation or something like that, you would get a lot more differences in elevation over varying scales. Did I?
Yes, yeah, that's exactly it. And the multi-scale component is that it's going to compare that variability at different sizes and then just picks up the maximum.
Yeah. Okay, cool. That's great. That's something I have been wondering about for a long time. So appreciate that. A second question then, again, based on very basic work that I've done in this area. So you've got this spectral. Well, like you said, you're moving up to 10 bands with the new drone. You've got the roughness from the elevation. But are there any other variables in the environment that can be clued in on? I'm thinking maybe something chemical. Like, is there something that the different from the oyster beds than from the mud flats, from the vegetation that can be pulled out?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the things that
may not be the right thing to think about, but you know,
yeah. So I have a student right now looking at seascape ecology, so the patterns in the landscape, and the kind of things we're looking at is wave exposure, shelter from the main gulf. So sometimes we have like barrier island, and then the reefs or the mudflats are behind. So we're trying to really see what else could contribute to the settlement or the health of different habitat types. We haven't looked into the chemistry, for example, yet, although there are teams that do a lot of work with like water filtering and carbon sequestration and these kind of things. So that's I think we probably have the data somewhere to see if we could integrate them with what we have.
Okay. All right. Thanks very much. That's great. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
All right, Arnaud.
Hi, yeah, thanks for the presentation. Actually, I think we kind of did our PhD at the same time at MUN, so
Yeah.
it's nice to see you again. Quick question. So I have a few students, I have a couple of students doing eelgrass, eelgrass meadow mapping using drone. And so the question I have is quite practical and technical, but it's one of them is particularly interested in using object-based image analysis. And so my question is, what platform will you recommend for that? So right now we are trying to explore whether we do that, sorry, within ArcGIS, or whether we use, there is an R package, SegOptim, I think something like that. There's Python option. And the question is, given, the low resolution of the drone, the high resolution of the drone image, so a couple of centimeters, the scale of the grass bed, which are usually 10, 15 hectares, so we realize that with our SegOptim, like, it can be very slow sometimes to process the image. So what will you recommend, like, given that, you're very advanced and very knowledgeable about that?
Yeah, so we did start with the eCognition software, which is a pretty pricey software, but it was at the when object-based image analysis became a thing in remote sensing, it was only offered in Ecognition. So the algorithms are more advanced, and they have an optimization procedure that is very powerful to set your parameters. They have a multi-resolution algorithms that allow to determine that minimum mapping unit for the objects. So very powerful tool, but our goal was to make everything open source for our state agency that can't afford, for example, Ecognition. So we have been using, most of our workflows now are using SegOptim in R. It is, you need the infrastructure to support the analysis. So we've been cheating a little bit and using the supercomputer here to kind of accelerate that, which I admit, for example, our state agency wouldn't have access to. But yeah, I would stay away from ArcGIS for now, just because they are just getting into the game of object-based analysis, image analysis, although nowadays we know much more about the different algorithms than we used to. Ecognition remains the top in the field, but is commercial, and I think R is very promising with the SegOptim. I see Evan. Evan made a put a question in the chat. The answer is no. Good to see you. The answer is no, because we haven't published anything yet, because there's always something. I think it's going to be not a controversial paper, but a paper that will have a lot of people will have an opinion about it. You know, if we're making such clear recommendations that this is an area that could be protected, that would limit impact on oil and gas current activities, but then the fisheries folks would come in and say, well, we fish there. So we're really trying to make it as robust as possible. Initially, we were only using Maxent as the algorithm. We tried to publish the first paper using Maxent, and it got rejected because, you know, it was identified as a very promising, but people disagreed with the use of Maxent. So then we started looking into Ensemble modeling, which is the new kind of recommendation, from the literature. So people are interested. I've presented it at a few conferences. People are interested, but before I put it out there for clear recommendation, it has to be as strong as it can be. So that's why I'm looking into trade-offs. And next week I'll be in Louisiana, and I'll meet with Patrick Etnoyer, who's a coral, like Gulf of Mexico coral expert, and I hope we can have a frank discussion about the potential for this work.
Yeah, it sounds like you have to include the fisheries footprint as well.
Yeah.
If those data are actually available, and I don't know if they are.
So for the fisheries data, I mean, I could look into AIS data and such, but what we have is very broad grid, because the leases and the access. So, and the truth is that the entire Gulf is for sale. So, there's no, it's really cut in big grids, and you can just apply for a lease or buy a lease. And so it's so challenging to say we want to limit active commercial exploitation, because it's everywhere. So then the question becomes, do we just present the models saying, this is where corals are most likely to be found, or do we bring that further with the analyzing the overlap with different types of commercial exploitation? And then do we bring it even further with recommending scenarios for a network of MPA? Yeah. And we're missing a big part of the Gulf. We don't have the shallow water, which is where the current flower garden marine protected area is located. So we're missing a lot of context too.
But the flower gardens is a tropical reef environment.
Yeah, shallower waters.
Coral. So it's a different kind of ecosystem. Yeah. Anyway, I have to go, but great stuff. Nice to see you.
Yeah, great seeing you.
So long.
Thank you, Evan.
Thank you for presenting this.
Belen, you have a question? You're muted.
So nice to meet you, Dr. Vincent Lecours. I'm a PhD student of for the Ocean Lab. We study mapping too. My supervisor is Kathleen Roberts, and I'm doing a PhD studying ROV data from Charlie Fracture Zone and from the Galapagos Islands, specifically seamounts in the Galapagos Islands, so deep sea. And so I'm using ArcGIS Metashape and Cloud Compare to obtain different terrain metrics, such as rugosity, as well as you. I work at very fine scale, but the reason we use this software instead of ArcGIS is because the structures we are looking at are mostly vertical. So we're looking into vertical walls or structures that have very steep slope. So the limitations at using this software that I'm mentioning, ArcGIS Metashape, is that the time and the power that we need for the computer is quite high. I don't know if you have any advice or technique that might exist that we can further use. Instead of that, we can use ArcGIS Pro. If you know any package or any way to study communities like cold water corals and sponges in vertical structures at very fine scale. I hear you talking about oysters and mud, but this is more flat structure, and then you can apply the different models, terrain models that you mentioned, and I'm familiar with that. But in terms of vertical structures, maybe you know about something that we don't.
Yeah, so no, we've been doing a little bit of vertical stuff too with coral reefs in the south of Florida, and we use Cloud Compare and Metashape. We, in a sense, it's very computationally intensive because it does through 3D measurements. So the algorithms, you know, a lot of the stuff I presented uses 2.5D data, which is basically 2D data with the value representing the elevation, while in Cloud Compare you're going to get the real 3D. So it's much more complex for the computer to analyze. But so anyway, for vertical structure, I would say you're doing the right thing with Cloud Compare. It's just it takes a lot of resources. An alternative that could be done that I haven't seen done is shift the frame of reference. So instead, it is moving. You know, let's say you work in ArcGIS, it assumes that the land is is below, but there might be a way to shift a geographic frame of reference from 90 degrees, and then you would work on the data as if it was the seafloor. So you would still capture your vertical rugosity, your slope, but it would be on a 90-degree plane difference.
It makes sense. Do you know about where can I find information regarding how to do that, how to switch the frame of reference from 90 degrees to a flat terrain? I was looking for, but I really haven't come across anything practical.
I don't. My guess would be that you would need to create a custom. So, you know, when you project your data in ArcGIS, you define, you say, well, I'm using NAD83 UTM zone, but there's a way to build customs frame of reference. And then there might be a way to just adjust one of the parameters to 90 degrees and then reproject your data into that new projection that you would make. But no, I'm not. I haven't seen it done, so I don't know.
That's a really good advice. I will look into that further. Yeah, and I have another question, but I want to keep it for later regarding your presentation. So I will let someone else talk for now.
Sounds good.
Thank you so much. I will look into that.
You're welcome.
I don't think we have anybody else with their hands up, so you can keep talking, Belen. You can ask another question. If Vincent is gonna, if he's okay to stay.
Yeah, I have time.
Now it's working.
There we go.
Okay, so yeah, in your presentation, I find interesting that you mentioned that there is a declaration of MTA in an area where it's a specific species of coral, and that one is a large area. But then there is another area that contains a higher diversity of different species of coral, but it's smaller. And then you also mentioned that the goal will be to limit the economical impact and the active infrastructure while still declaring these marine protected areas. I wonder how in practice that can work and what specifically means to limit the economic impact in the
the active infrastructures, which active infrastructures, and how could you actually make those extractivists and marine and protected areas goals to match? How is it working there in Florida?
Yeah, so it's I'll be perfectly honest, I did not that is exploratory, and I didn't involve anyone that would do management or decision making or these kind of things. So it's kind of hypothetical. But what we've done is we predicted species distribution across the Gulf. Then we found a spatial data set of all the oil and gas infrastructure that are active. So there's currently oil going through those pipelines, and there's platforms and stuff like that. Then in the literature, we found that the direct impact from those structure on local sedimentation, local currents, and all these things was felt 4 kilometers away. So what we've done is we took all those pipelines, all those platforms, applied a 4 kilometers buffer around them, and identified that as the zone of influence, of direct influence of the infrastructure. And then by overlapping that on our predictions of where the corals were found, we're actually able to say these infrastructure potentially have a direct impact on 20% of suitable habitats. And then we flipped the question around. So we said, well, if we want to protect areas, because we could say, you know, well, then we got to remove those platforms, or we got to remove those pipelines. But if we don't want a big uproar from the oil and gas company, what we decided to do is, well, if it impacts 20% of the suitable habitat, that means there's still 80% that is outside of that direct zone of influence. So then we focused on that remaining 80%, identified the big areas, and then we assumed that if we were to protect those areas, the oil and gas companies wouldn't be mad because it's not affecting their active current infrastructure. But that's a far-fetched assumption, because, you know, some oil and gas companies might have leases that, you know, they are not actively exploiting, but would explore maybe in the future. As I told Evan earlier, you know, it doesn't involve the fisheries that might be fishing those areas. So it's a very complex question. And my goal is definitely not to answer the question, but to provide the tools to drive the discussions.
Right. Yeah, I think your work is awesome in the aspect, and hopefully the different management listen to the science that you're developing.
Yeah, I hope so too.
Really enjoy your presentation. I hope to see you again giving more presentations here in the Marine Institute.
I'm sure we will. Yeah, I know Kathleen quite well, so I'm sure we'll.
That's wonderful. So I hope to see you soon. Thank you so much for the answers.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Belen. I was kind of wondering, earlier you said BOEM just released that data set. And was that all for was the people who were able to access that before? Was it just BOEM, or were they leasing it, or were they giving it to people who bought that area for gas and stuff like that?
No, it's not that type of scenario. It's more like they didn't have the data, and then what they did. So that data is a compilation. So they didn't go out there and mapped it. What they did is they looked at a bunch of seismic profiles. You know, there's been decades of ocean oil and gas exploration in the Gulf. So they just gathered all the data set. They were able to identify the profile of the seafloor from these thousands of seismic surveys, and then they interpolated and created that pretty neat data set. So it wasn't that they were hiding it or keeping it behind a paywall. It's just that they didn't have the data before, and then they took the time to compile it and to provide a pretty good product. But as a federal agency, I don't think they would be allowed to keep it behind a paywall.
True, that's right. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I wouldn't say anything bad about BOEM. They paid me for 4 years while I was there at UF. So, but yeah, I think that's it for questions and everything. Thank you so much for doing this for us. This is our last seminar, guys. So I'm sorry, you're gonna have to go back to work now. No more Wednesday noon seminars. So, all right, yeah, thank you so much, Thank you so much, Dr. Lecours. That was
You're welcome, and thanks for the invitation.
Yeah. Tell Allison I said hi, and I miss her doing all my grunt work.
Sounds good. I'll tell her.
Bye.
Bye.